Welcome to the Photoshop editing section. So what we're going to do now, we've learned the basics, and now we're going to learn how to really edit photography and photos. And as a graphic designer, you're most likely going to receive and work with photos that are not edited, and it's going to be up to you to tweak it to make it match a project. A lot of times clients will take their own photography for their restaurant or a picture of their product, and it's less than desired. And it's your job to make sure it looks excellent, sharp, bright, and matches the mood of the design. So we're going to learn some very basic things here. In the downloadable files as part of the course, you'll have 4 different photo assets that we're going to use in this section. The first one is a texture. The second one is an hourglass. The third one, a piano. And the fourth one, a plant. And these are all photos I took in my own home with a very simple iPhone X. I did 0 prior editing to these photos. These are right off my phone. And the reason I wanted to do this is when I taught this section before, I would take photos off those awesome photo websites like pexels.com, and a lot of those were already really well done and professionally edited photos by photographers. What I wanted to do is teach you how to edit photos that are right off of a phone or right off of a camera that need that final touch. The first photo, which is going to be the hourglass. We're going to just drag that right into Photoshop as a new document. You can also go to File, Open, and find it that way too. You'll notice when you open it as a new document that we don't have smart objects on, like we talked about in the prior lesson. We can simply right-click and just make sure that smart objects are on, convert to smart object. We're going to need that when we're doing our adjustments. So now that it's a smart object, and we can tell because of the icon, we are going to really dive into the adjustments panel. So remember in the first few lessons of Photoshop, we talked about how you can go up to Image, go up to Adjustments, and this is kind of where all of your photo editing tools live, is right up here. But there's also a panel that you can pull up called Adjustments, which has a lot of these same settings. They're really the same options. If you do not see the Adjustments panel, simply go up to Window and just make sure Adjustments is checked. So here's the difference, and don't worry if you get a little bit confused. It's a little confusing because you can access it through the panel or you can access it here, but it does things a little bit differently. So when I go up to Image, Adjustments, and let's say I want to add a little bit of brightness and contrast to this photo, I can select Brightness and Contrast. And we're going to have some sliders here, and we can increase the brightness, which it does exactly what it says. It's going to bring out all of those highlights and make them more white or lighter. And let's say we want to add contrast. So that's going to change the difference between all the white pixels and the dark pixels. It's going to go ahead and add more dramatic differences between the two. So it's going to make your darker pixels darker and your lighter pixels lighter. So let's go ahead and increase the contrast. We're going to click OK. This is just to demonstrate what happens if we go this route and we go to Image Adjustments. And you'll notice because I have this as a smart layer, any adjustment that I add, it's going to add it as a smart filter, because if you add any kind of filter or adjustment on a smart layer, it's going to be a smart filter. What is amazing about this is I can toggle this on and off. So I'm just doing the visibility on and off, so that's before and after. And I can also delete it. So if I just click this smart layer and drag, I can delete that layer and I'm back to my original photo. If this wasn't a smart layer, so let's just right click, rasterize layer, and it was just a regular layer, I can go up to Image, Adjustments, and do the same thing. Brightness, contrast. Let's make it really dramatic so we can see the difference. Click OK, and notice I don't have that extra smart filter. I can't delete it. Once it's done, it's over. I can't go back and change anything. I can go back in my history panel and go back one step. But let's say I've already done 5 other edits to it. I changed the color and sharpened it and did several things. I have to go all the way back to this step if I wanted to change or adjust anything. So let's go back in our history panel to right before we rasterized the layer, and now it's back as a smart object. So I can go back to Image, Adjustments, Brightness, Contrast, make it really bright, and let's say, oh, that's over processed, didn't like that. I have the smart filter where I can go to select brightness and contrast. I can double click the text brightness and contrast and it'll pull up slider and I can bring it right back down to a normal level, maybe not quite as bad, and change the contrast and click OK. And I can adjust it again and again and again, and I don't have to go back in my history panel. I can continue to edit this, and I can manage all sorts of smart filters. So every adjustment I can make I can go back and edit it again without changing everything else in the document. So let's delete this smart filter. I'm just going to click and drag it into the trash can. And let's start fresh. And we're going to do most of these adjustments. And this is where it gets a little complicated, but you can rewatch the video. We'll do lots of this practice in the future. But if you were to add let's say this is a smart object, I am adding brightness and contrast, and I did some kind of adjustment. And you see how it's the main photo is a parent and the smart filter is a child. So this smart filter only applies to this layer, and that's it. I can't drag this filter anywhere else to affect a second photo that was on the page. So let's drag another photo in just for an example. Let's drag this piano photo in. So this piano photo is unaffected by the smart filter, even if I drag it underneath. The brightness is not applied to that piano photo. But if I were to go a different route and I use the adjustments panel right here, it'll apply the same filter, smart filter, but it'll do so not dependent on that layer. So let's start fresh. We just have 2 images as an example. And instead, we're going to use this adjustments panel. Instead of going up to image, adjustments, and adding it, we're going to add it through the adjustments panel. So let's do hue and saturation. And let's do kind of a pretty big shift in the hue. And let's make it highly saturated. So that made a dramatic effect on that layer. But notice that this layer is not affected. But this is now its own layer, as before it was nested as a child. And it was only affecting that one layer and I couldn't move it. This I can bring on the top and affect all the layers in the document. So now all the layers are affected by this hue and saturation. I can toggle it on and off, and I can also delete it. So there's 2 different ways you can add adjustments. Really, if you were to add image adjustments through the top image menu system, it'll do it only on that layer that you select. If you do it as a part of adjustments, it'll do its own independent layer, which you can move around. So there's benefits to both methods. There's no wrong or right way. It just really depends on how you want to use the filters. If you want it to affect everything in the document, then use your adjustments panel window. If you just want it to affect that one layer and that's it, then I would go up to image and adjustments and just affect the one layer. That's a little confusing, but don't worry. This is probably one of the more difficult aspects of Photoshop. We are back to square one, and we're going to go through all of these adjustments. So let's go ahead and zoom in. I'm going down to zoom in. Let's try 50% and really get in on that hourglass. So this is an hourglass I have on my bookshelf, and I encourage you can use these photos, my photos that I took with unedited from my phone, but I encourage you to take your phone and snap some pictures. They don't have to be perfect. That's the whole goal, is to take imperfect pictures on your phone and really make them look a little bit more polished, edited, and refined. So I'm going to use my adjustments panel for this one, and this is going to create smart filters that can be moved around to different layers if I ever choose to do so. So let's start with brightness contrast. We've already kind of done this a little bit. When I do select brightness contrast within the panel here, the adjustments panel option, you'll also see in your properties panel here the sliders. So that's kind of nice to have all of this together. So in my properties panel, if you don't see your properties panel, just make sure you go up to window and make sure it's selected. So now I can change the brightness and contrast, make it brighter, or I can take all of the darker pixels and make them more dark. But let's add a little, you don't need to kind of get too over processed here. Let's just bump it up a little brightness here. And let's do contrast. So we want to darken the shadows and lighten the highlights at the same time to create a contrast. So we're going to increase the contrast, and you notice when I increase it all the way, it almost looks artistic because you usually don't have natural occurring contrast this dramatic. So it almost looks like a digital painting. And some people, when they do digital paintings and artworks, or they take a photo and they try to make it look like a digital painting, they'll use a lot of high contrast because it's just not as naturally dramatic in real life. And you can also lower it. So if I lower contrast, it's going to look a little more washed out. And there's definitely times stylistically when you want to have something more subtle. So let's just increase the contrast. You know, you can do any level, not all the way. Let's kind of do in the middle here. So just going to do 50. And I think it kind of brings out a lot of the shadows and highlights here. And I do use brightness and contrast a lot. So that's definitely one. Some of these I don't use very often, and there's some that I use quite a bit with graphic design, and brightness and contrast is probably something I use every time I edit a photo. So let's talk about levels, and this is not a photo editing course, it's a graphic design course. So I don't want to get super duper detailed with photo editing because you could spend 20 hours in Photoshop just on photo editing. It's a little bit more for photographers when they're taking their photos and they're selling them and they're giving them to clients. We just want a photo to look great for our design, and we want to know the basics, and that's what this course is going to focus on. Not so much the super duper details of photo editing. And this is when levels can be really powerful but also pretty complex. So right here we're in levels, and I'm going to go ahead and bring out my properties panel just so you can kind of see what's going on a little bit better. And I'm also going to bring out my layers panel so you can customize these in any way so you can kind of see everything at once. What levels does is there's white points and there's black points. So white points are right here. This is all the white colors that are in the document, and then there's black points, so it's all the black dark colors in the document. And you can shift these levels around so that you reduce the amount of black or white in the photo. This is more about adjusting shadows and highlights. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take this black point right down here. This is our black point, and we can click and drag this, and what it's going to do is it's going to take every dark pixel and make it completely black. That's going to make it completely black. So the more I drag this in, the more all of the pixels become black or dark. And the opposite is true. If I take this white point, I click and I drag down, it's going to take all of the current lighter pixels and slowly make more and more of them white. This is kind of your white point. So you can get almost all the way to completely white or all the way to completely dark. This is a very great natural way to add contrast. Of course, you also have brightness and contrast, which kind of does some of this for you. But this gives you complete control. And this is where it does get so advanced, only, photographers will really need to know the super duper details. And as designers, it's really great for us to be aware and to explore it. And these are your midtones. So this is your 50% gray. So it's all the kind of gray midtones, because you have highlights, you have shadows, and then you have everything in between, which is not really dark, it's not really light, it's a midtone, it's kind of in the middle, and you can change that point too. So let's say I wanted to add some quick contrast. I can bring a lot of those darker pixels and bring that black point higher, so it's going to take all those darker pixels and make them black. And same with this, I can bring it in. So if I bring both the white and the black points together, it creates this super duper high contrast look. Maybe not go quite as far, just little adjustments. And what's great about, let's go ahead and show the layers panel here. What's great about having this layer, I did it through the adjustments panel. So this layer is now its own layer. I can drag this across other photos if I wanted to. But right now, all these layers now apply to everything that's underneath. So right now we just have this photo, but both of these, the levels adjustment we made and the brightness contrast adjustment we made, all apply to everything underneath. And if I were to go to image and adjustments and do it this way, it would only be applying to the hourglass no matter how many other photos or layers I had in the document. So at any time I can go back and edit. So let's say, ooh, that was too much adjustment on the levels. So I can highlight that and I automatically have it populated in my properties panel, and I can back it off a little bit if I felt like I went a little too overboard. So that was levels, and now we're going to talk about curves. So what is the difference between curves and levels? Well, curves gives you more minute control using an S-curve. And that sounds complicated, but it pretty much, levels and curves do the same thing, which is take your darker pixels and make them lighter, take your lighter pixels and make them darker, and you can also change your midtones as well. So let's say we're in curves, and it's going to be the same thing we just talked about in levels, and levels is a much easier tool to use. This is a little bit more advanced. So we could just select the darker pixels, which is down here. You're going to see this kind of line going up across. So this is white, and this goes all the way down to black. And so this is black, and this goes all the way to white. This represents the lighter and darker pixels are the tonal curve in the photo. So you can see this huge spike. So these are the darker pixels, and there's definitely some darker pixels in here, kind of your midtones are here. And then you see this big spike in this photo, and that is most likely because of all of these light pixels that are in the background. And each photo is going to be different. Really dark photography is going to have maybe some spikes up here in all of the darker pixels because it has more darker pixels. So let's say I wanted to take all of the darker pixels and make them a bit brighter. So I'm going to kind of select this black point and slide it across. And it's going to take it's going to do the same things that levels did. And it's going to make all those darker pixels darker. And the same thing over here, we can take this white point and drag it and make all of those white points whiter, or all the white pixels whiter. And the thing about levels is everything is on a curve, so I can change different points along the curve. So what I can do is I can set different points. So let's say I want these very darkest of colors to be lighter. So I'm going to click at the very bottom and bring it up, and it's going to lighten all of those dark pixels, and it's going to make it much more a lighter profile. But what's great about curves is I can take your midtones, and instead of just making everything bright and washed out, I could take the midtones and make them a little darker. You could take right here where you have all of your whitest pixels, and I can bring those down, or I can bring them up and make them brighter, almost white. So that's the only difference. It pretty much does the same thing. It makes darker pixels whiter and whiter pixels darker, but it gives you just more control because you can really do as many points here and make lots of fine adjustments. We probably don't need both levels and curves. Pick the one that you feel like is easiest for you to use. Levels is a more simplistic version of this activity. So we can delete curves, we can keep levels, but we probably don't need both on this. So I'm just going to delete one. And anytime I want to make an adjustment, I select this and I'm able to go back and make an adjustment. So let's say that's gray. I really want it to be a little bit more white. I can click right here where it spikes, move it up, and then I can also click next to it and move this back down so that only those lightest pixels are affected, just making them a little bit brighter. And that's it. So let's move on. I promise they're not all this complicated. I think levels and curves are probably the most complicated of all the adjustment options. Let's go ahead and move on to exposure. So the term exposure comes from photography. So when you use a traditional camera with a flash, how much was the lens open during that time where the light was flashing? What's kind of your exposure? How much light did that camera get a chance to soak in? And so this has a very dramatic effect. So I'm going to move this along the slider and add exposure, and it's going to do super big changes. So you don't need to go all the way out here. It's going to look incredibly washed out, overexposed, using the correct term. Or I can reduce, go negative exposure, and it pretty much can go all the way to black. If you don't have any light and you take a photo, you're not going to get any picture, you're just going to get a black photo. So this is exactly what exposure does. I tend to, whenever a photo is just a little dark, Sometimes I like to go to brightness and contrast and use the brightness setting, but sometimes if I need to really brighten a photo, sometimes I'll just do a little bit of exposure just to add a little bit of that brightness. I brought in a very kind of dark photo from pexels.com that I found that I thought would be able to show these effects a little bit better with exposure. So I'm in my adjustments panel. I'm going to go over to exposure. So let's say I want to add just some quick brightness. So I'm just going to slide this just ever so slightly over and it's going to brighten it up. But you notice as I do this, it gets really overexposed and processed. You have these high blocks of just pure white and it doesn't look very good. So this is when you just need to add a tiny bit to bump it up. There's also offset. What offset does is it leaves the highlights alone and changes just the midtones and the shadows. So let's increase the offset, and you notice how it's leaving the highlights alone when I increase it. And it kind of almost adds this gray tone to it. And you can also subtract. And once again, these are to be used just very little bit. So I'm going to increase the offset, and it kind of brings, notice how it's just completely dark, just nudging it a little bit, kind of makes it a little bit more of a dark gray rather than black. And gamma correction changes the midtones. So I can increase gamma correction, and you'll notice on the slider, when I move to the right, it actually decreases. It's kind of tricky because it's kind of the reverse. So now it's getting darker. But I want to make it lighter, so I'm going to add, which is moving to the left, to gamma correction. It kind of brightened up those darker areas. So you notice how I didn't use a whole, I'm not sliding this all the way to the left or right, just very small moves. If I ever feel like I messed up and I want to go back, I can always click right down here to reset, and I can reset everything back to normal. So now I know just to maybe do a little bit of exposure, just brightens it up a little bit. Maybe add just a tiny bit of gamma correction, and all of a sudden you can kind of see a little bit of the left side of her face kind of come more into the scene. So I just wanted to change the photo so you can kind of see that more in action. I'm back here to my hourglass, and I've already done something with levels. I've already kind of really changed the contrast and added a lot of brightness to my photo. So when it comes to exposure, any little movement is going to really make it look over processed. So I'm just going to do a very small adjustment and maybe add a little bit of gamma so my midtones can get a little lighter, and that's it. And I don't use these adjustments for every single photo. There might be just 2 or 3 that I use per photo. The next one on the list is vibrance. So we're going to click right here on vibrance, and it's going to allow us to add vibrance and saturation. So let's say we have this flower, and let's go ahead and zoom in on it, and we really want to bring out more of the color. We can go to saturation and quickly add color and more saturation to all of the hues quickly by sliding it to the right. So now it really pops out. It's highly saturated colors. It just takes the original hue of a pixel and moves it all the way higher to a higher saturation. You can also desaturate something really quickly by sliding it all the way to the left. You're taking away all the saturation from every hue and every pixel. And so what this does is this saturates every pixel in the photo, just everything. So what happens if you oversaturate? It can look overprocessed. What vibrance does is it doesn't select every single pixel, but just the ones that are already bright to begin with. So it's not going to do every single pixel in the photo, just ones that are already have a little bit of saturation to them, and it just makes them more saturated. So it's more selective. If I were to increase vibrance all the way, see what that looks like compared to saturation. So if I increase the saturation, it does look overprocessed. What it's going to do, it's going to add saturation to every single thing, even these that don't originally had saturation, and this will add saturation to selected things that already had a little bit of saturation. So it's more selective, it's a little bit easier to use, just wanted to talk about the difference. A lot of times, to be honest, as a graphic designer, we have to do a lot of quick editing for projects. A lot of times you just kind of get used to what works. In the past, for certain things, you just kind of do a slider real quick. Yes, I like that. Slide that a little bit. Yes, I like that. And you click OK. There's a science to every one of these, but there's also what looks good, what is looking good to your eye. And that's kind of more of a casual way to edit. Don't get overwhelmed or burdened by choosing everything, learning all these technical behind the scenes, what's going on to the pixels. Just experiment with each one of these. Find your favorites. Get used to kind of points that you like to slide it to. A lot of time, I've done this for so many years, you end up opening a photo and you go, yes, I need to increase the vibrance. I need to maybe bring out, use levels and kind of lighten it. I need to change the brightness and contrast a little bit, and that's it. And you just kind of, you open a photo and you just kind of learn like exercising a muscle. You kind of have muscle memory when it comes to what these things, how these adjustments affects photos. All right, so we're back to our hourglass. I have vibrance selected. I really want to bring out this blue in the hourglass. I want that to become more saturated and higher, rich blue color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the saturation. And you'll notice it did every single pixel. Well, it's doing this gold and making it look a little overdone. So let's try vibrance. I just want to add a little pop to the colors. I think that looks a little bit more reasonable. So now we get to go to hue and saturation. So this is a quick way to change the hue on an entire photo. So we have a hue slider. So right now this is kind of in a neutral position, but if I were to add to the hue, it kind of goes along this color scale. So it's kind of slowly changing colors. You get a pretty wide range of colors as you move it across. Same thing goes if I go back to neutral and I do negative hue, it'll go down and do a wide range of color. So it's a great way to kind of do a very quick dramatic shift in color. And you also have a saturation option slider here as well. And then a lightness, which will just kind of do an overall light or bright. This is one I use often. This is a big one along with brightness and contrast that I use the most often. What's really neat about this is you can click on colorize right down here. This little box, going to go ahead and tick colorize. And what I can do is I can do a quick color change that's kind of monochromatic. So it's just all one color. And I can slide it along the hue slider all the way to 360, which is basically the entire color wheel. So you can kind of slide it all along. It's going to do the full hue, full saturation, go all the way to full saturation. It's going to make it really crazy. So you don't have to do all the way full saturation. Let's do kind of a little bit in the middle. And you could do a quick color change just by ticking the colorize box. So let's say I wanted to change it from kind of gold to maybe a little bit more warm tones, maybe a tiny bit more like copper. I could just slide this to the left and it just makes a small adjustment. I mean, you don't want to go too far, then it starts to look brown, but just kind of a slight move to the left. And if I don't like any of these, or I want to see what's the final effect and go back to how I had it before, you can toggle off any one of these adjustment layers to kind of figure out which one you think has a good effect or a bad effect. So now color balance. Color balance allows us to do what we did before, but do it more selectively. So we have the cyan to red, magenta to green, and yellow to blue. These are opposites on the color wheel, so we can slide this. So let's say I have this kind of cyan blue color. I happen to have that in my hourglass. I'm going to slide it over to red. It's going to add a little bit of red tones. I could do the opposite, and it's going to add a little bit of cyan to the whole photo. And this is not at all selective, it just does the entire document. So let's say I feel like it has some yellow undertones that I don't like, and I'm going to add just a tiny bit of blue to counter that. I can go down to this yellow blue slider and I can add a little blue. Just a little bit. So notice how it went from You have like yellow, kind of looks like too many yellow undertones. And now we can just add a little bit of blue. And what makes this a little bit more complicated is that was just midtones. Those were all the midtone pixels in the document. We also have shadows, which are your darker colors, and highlights, which are your lighter. So you can change the highlights in the same way. So I'm going to bring in another photo so I can I use this a lot, and I just want to kind of show you what it looks like on a person. So I have a new photo here, and I just wanted to demonstrate color balance. So let's say there's a lot of warm tones, and I want to and what's kind of been in the last couple years is adding more cooler tones to photography. So what I want to do is add a little bit of blue, and I'm just right here, default on the midtones. And I'm just going to slide it to blue a little bit. And it's going to take a lot of that yellowness away. So that's kind of what it was before. Just adds a little blue, very small change. So that's kind of before and then after. Now that's just midtones. You can also continue to do shadows in the same way. And then highlights. And some photos naturally have maybe some green undertones that aren't really good for skin. So you can kind of add a little warmth by taking away green and adding a little bit of magenta. So just small changes that you can do. I can go back to my history panel, which is right over here. I can go back to before and then after. And the only thing I used was the color balance adjustments. So before and after. So back to our hourglass. We can continue to take away those yellows and add a little bit of blue. Midtones, let's do it with highlights. Maybe not highlights because it's kind of changing the lighter pixels, and I don't want that wall to look blue. So we don't have to change that. But let's change some of the shadows, add a little blue, just a tiny bit. You don't want it to look super blue. Just very small changes, which is all adjustments are about, of those little changes that add up. So black and white, this one's pretty self-explanatory. What's great about black and white is you have control over previously colored pixels in the image. So it has the reds, yellows, greens, and cyans. So any pixels that used to be red, you can change them here. And what's great is it gives you individual control over all these different colors so that you can kind of do the black and white your own way. So we can make this almost look white, like white sand. And this is why it's having an effect on just the sand, because it was blue, it was cyan. So now we're taking away cyan and it turns black. We're able to kind of isolate and select that one color. And we didn't have a whole lot of magenta. So you notice how as I slide it, you're not seeing big changes because there wasn't a lot of magenta in this photo. So it gives you lots of control. Instead of just doing black and white, you can kind of make adjustments so that I think this just works a little bit better. You can even add a quick tint by ticking the tint box. You can add some sepia or add blues on your hue slider. So you can add a slight tint to that if you'd like. But I don't want to do black and white for this, so I'm simply going to take my black and white and drag it in the trash. So now we're going to do photo filter. So we're going to click on photo filter, and this is a super quick way to kind of add an overall color, warmer, cooler tones to your photo. They have a bunch of built-in filters that you can click, and you have warming filters. They have cooling filters, which is going to bring in kind of your cooler colors. You can change the density, which is basically it changes kind of the intensity, I guess you could say, of the effect of it. So you can have it 100%. Go back to warming filter, it kind of had the orange color, or you can have it just be a very small change. I'm going to bring in another photo to demonstrate this in action. So I downloaded this landscape image from pexels.com, and what I really find photo filters great for is it's a quick way to make a photo look like it's possibly an evening or kind of changing the time of day. So just a quick warming filter, which is going to add kind of an orange color. You can also select the color and change it, so you're not stuck with whatever is on these filters. You can do more than that. You can click on the color and adjust it, making it a different shade. So let's say I want to change the density and it'll look a little bit more like an evening shot than it does a noon shot. So just kind of adding a little bit of color here. So let's do before. Let's go ahead and toggle on and off. So that's kind of looks like it's maybe taken at 4 o'clock or maybe in the morning. And this just kind of adds a little bit. It's just something kind of really quick that you can do to a photo to add just almost like a little filter on top in terms of color. So let's talk about selective color. There is a lot of power to selective color. So I'm going to do selective color, and on my properties panel, it gives me access to all of the red pixels, yellow pixels, green pixels, cyan. So kind of similar to when we did black and white. I have control over all of these, which is super cool. So let's say I want to change the color of this is all cyan color, kind of a bluish cyan color. So I'm going to go to my drop down menu and I'm going to select my cyan colors. And what I can do is I can change the color this way. So it's going to change all of those cyan colors in the photo to whatever I like. I can add more cyan, I can take it away, I can add magenta, take it away, add yellow, and then of course add black. So let's add cyan, and you notice it makes it darker. We could take it away and it makes it kind of a little bit more white. We can add a little magenta in there to make it darker or take it away. We can add black to it or we could take it away. So we can kind of make it a little bit more rich by adding more cyan. Maybe add a little magenta and it's a lot darker, a lot more rich, isn't it? And same thing, you might have a little blue in there too. So we're on blues now, and it's what I do to know how it's going to have an effect, to see which pixels are going to be blue and which ones are going to be selected. A lot of times I'll go to black and I can quickly kind of see what's going to be affected, and it doesn't look like there's a whole lot that will be affected. So we know there's probably going to be a lot of whites and a lot of neutrals because of this background right here. This is probably more gray than it is white. So I'm going to choose neutrals, which will kind of be your grays. And I can do my black slider to see what's going to be affected. So it's going to be all of these pixels that are going to be affected. I can now add yellow or take away yellow. So I'm going to bring in another photo so I can show you this in a little more detail. I'm going to go ahead and find selective color. And with this photo, we have all these beautiful blue butterflies and kind of this blue forest background. So when we go to blues, it's going to have a huge effect on all these colors. So if I were to add cyan or add magenta, notice how it changes all of those colors that were previously blue. I can make them darker, or I can make everything a lot lighter. So that just really affects it quite a bit. So let's say if I go to reds, there's not a lot of reds in this photo. If I were to go to black and make a quick change, I don't even think there's any red. So it doesn't really matter what I do because there's not a lot of red pixels in this photo. But there are blacks. There's blacks to most photos. So if I go to black and I add more black, it's going to darken the black, and this will lighten the black. But you can also add undertones, like some warm undertones, by adding magenta. So you notice how it went from kind of greenish, yellowish dirt, kind of added a little bit magenta to it. So super powerful, super selective, and I just wanted to kind of demonstrate that with another photo. One time for a client, I had to take a picture that was once summertime, and I had to take it of a vineyard, and I had to turn it into fall. Somehow I had to change the seasons. It seemed really impossible, but using selective color, it made it a lot easier. So I have this picture, it's obviously right in the middle of summer, and we're going to make it look like it's from autumn by using selective color. So I'm in my adjustments panel, I'm doing selective color, and I'm going to select all of the greens and the yellows, and I'm going to be adding some more oranges and reds. So let's start with green, and I'm going to be adding a little bit of magenta. We're adding kind of those yellows, orange, browns colors. And then we're going to go to yellows. And we're going to be reducing, so these are all everything that's kind of yellowish. We're going to be reducing the blue. And it's going to kind of bring out the yellows more. So you can almost see it turning into autumn slowly. I'm going to add a little bit of magenta. That's going to kind of make it a little more brown tones coming in. I'm going to do magenta. And you can see it's kind of bringing out oranges. We can add yellows. And we even go to our reds. And anything that was red, we want to make it more red, right? We want to bring out reds. So let's add a little magenta. And there's not going to be a whole lot that changes with this one. Just a few you kind of see on the right there. Change that to magenta. And just like that, we were able to take something. I'm going to go ahead and toggle the selective color off and on. That was summertime, and we made it autumn by using selective color to emulate fall leaves. So after, before, after, before. So pretty cool stuff. So let's go back to ours. Let's see what we can do about editing those yellows. And let's also, it could be yellows, but there's also kind of reds. I know it's warm tones. So let's see what we could do with our red, how much that's affected. So that's going to kind of be our table too. So we can change our table. Kind of subtract a little bit of yellow. It's all about experimentation, just like painting. You kind of see it, you know what's right. There's not going to be a right or wrong. Just find out what looks good to you. Everyone has a different desire. Everyone has a different goal for how they want their photo to look stylistically. And there's one more we're going to go over in great detail, and that is gradient map. We're going to take an image and apply a gradient map to it. We're going to do that a little bit later. I'm going to edit a few other photos so we can go through this process one more time a lot quicker, not going through each one, but picking out ones we think we need to use for a photo. So I have a couple more photos in that downloadable folder that we're going to go through and do some super quick edits so we can practice some of these adjustment tools. So this is our after of our hourglass, and we can go back to the before, and sometimes you don't realize how many changes you make until you see the original photo. And there's one thing I wanted to do, and it's one thing I like to do, especially with photos that are right from a phone, is I like to add a little sharpness. It just really helps to add a nice quality to most photos that were just taken on an unprofessional camera. I love to sharpen images. So I'm going to add a sharpness layer. So I want to sharpen this hourglass. So I'm going to select my layer, my smart object layer right here. I'm going to go up to filter. It's got its own sharpen category. We're going to go down to sharpen, and we're going to do just a quick regular sharpen. So we click on sharpen. It's going to sharpen the image for us. It added it as a smart layer, and I can easily remove this sharpening if I want to. If I don't like it, I can just drag it into the trash can. So this is our after. We sharpened it. We added a couple of adjustments. We didn't use every single one, but we used quite a bit. So this is after, and this is before. If I want to check out before, I can go back into my history panel. You could scroll all the way up to the top. If you click on the very top, it reverts it right back to where we started. It goes all the way back to the beginning before we did all of these different activities. So you can click all the way back at the bottom to load where we were, go all the way back up the top to see. So that's before. As you can see, it's a lot darker. It doesn't have the high saturation. It doesn't have the bright, vivid colors. You scroll all the way down here, you'll notice that we kind of added some really vibrant colors. It almost looks like a digital painting instead of just a picture that I took in my house. So there's the power of editing right there. Another thing you could do, that's just your history panel. Another thing you could do is you can group all these. So all these adjustments that we made, I'm just going to click once at the top, hold down Shift, click at the bottom. I can just quickly select all of my adjustments. I can throw them into a folder. So this helps when you have multiple photos you're working with in the same document. It's nice to just create a folder. So it's going to click on the folder. It's going to take everything that's highlighted and it's going to group it into a folder for me. And I can title this Adjustments. And I can easily toggle off the entire folder so I can have before and after. That is just a really quick way to kind of see your before and your after effects. So let's go ahead and work on our other photos really quickly, and I'll see you in the next lesson. I have the downloadable folder that goes with this section that has 4 different photos in it. We're going to go ahead and open this one right here of the plant. I'm going to bring that right into Photoshop. This is another thing. This is actually my fireplace, and I took it with my phone and I didn't touch it. It's right from my phone, and it needs a lot of work. It's a little dark, and I feel like the colors are not saturated enough. So we're going to go through a very, very similar process that we went with the hourglass. So one of the first things I like to do is just quickly go to brightness contrast. It's the easiest and quickest way to add some contrast. So I'm going to increase the brightness just a tad, just going to slide it. You don't want to do it too much or it just gets very washed out. So I just want to do a little bit, and I want to add a little bit of contrast as well. Once again, don't go overboard. That looks very overprocessed. You want to just do a quick adjustment. And so I can quickly go to levels, which is a whole lot easier to manage than curves. Doesn't give you as much options, but it's just a quick way to brighten up some of those brighter pixels. So what I want to do is I want to make some of these lighter pixels lighter. So I'm just going to go over to the white point and I'm going to drag it over to the left. So you notice how it's really, of course you can make it really just too much, but it's taking some of those brighter pixels and making them brighter. I can also adjust the midtones as well. I can make midtones darker or the midtones brighter. I make them just a little bit brighter and kind of leaving the black point alone. Super quick. I'm not going to use curves because if I pretty much choose one or the other, don't need to use both. So exposure, it's already pretty bright. I probably don't need to use exposure too much in this. I think if I would, it would just instantly look over process. So I'm going to click on revert back. So I'm going to just not use exposure at all for this one. Let's do vibrance because I really want to make the green really, really rich. So I'm going to increase the vibrance, and you'll notice the difference between kind of the warmer tones of the wood is coming out, and also the leaves are looking very vivid. So I don't want to go all the way. Let's kind of do something in the middle, and let's add a little saturation, and this is all just testing. You know, you don't really know what it's going to look like until you see the preview. That could look a little bit too saturated, so I have to be careful. So I just want to do a little saturation. Once again, I can toggle this off and on, so that's before, that's after. I think that's a nice amount. There's no perfect amount. It depends on the style that you're trying to go for. So color balance, let's say I think there's too much yellow in the walls. I can add a little bit of blue to counter some of that yellow. So I'm going to adjust the highlights, which most of this is going to be your lighter highlight pixels. And I'm going to just add a little bit of blue, which is basically taking away yellow. And notice how instantly it went from kind of yellowy walls to kind of a little bit more neutral color just by adding a little bit of blue. I guess I'll also do the same for midtones and see if any of my midtones would benefit from blue. But then it starts to get into some of the green pixels, and putting blue with a highly saturated green is going to dull the green, so let's not worry about that. I just edited the highlights, just added a little bit of blue. That's it. I'm not going to do anything else. I can go to selective color, and I can select my greens, so I can be very selective, just like the adjustment name refers to. I'm going to take my greens, and I'm going to go to black. I'm going to add black, see kind of what it does. And I'm going to subtract it. And that's kind of what it's going to affect. So what I want to do is I kind of want to lighten it. So I'm going to reduce the black on my greens. It's going to lighten it a little bit. So that's before, that's after, right? So I kind of want to do something in the middle. And what I've noticed is this probably has more yellow than I think it does. So let's go to yellow, pretty close to green, so there's probably overlap there. I'm going to go to my black to see how much it affects, and that actually it's more yellow pixels in there than green. So really what you're seeing is a mix between yellow and green to make up these leaves. It's not just green. So let's add a little darkness to it, or we can add a little lightness to it. If we take away some of those yellows and subtract black, it kind of looks washed out. But what if we were to add a little black? It kind of brings some of those shadows out of the leaves and it no longer looks washed out. So I feel like I'm done with this specifically. There's nothing else I want to do. You notice that took probably 3 or 4 minutes. If I didn't explain each step, it's probably a 3 or 4 minute edit. And that's usually how long it takes to do a quick edit for a photo for social media or for a website. It just, once you kind of learn some of the main adjustments and what they do, you'll be able to do this very, very quickly. You shouldn't be spending hours editing, doing these types of edits to photos. That's when you get into the finer details of photo editing, like skin retouching and other types of retouching, which is a lot more specific to only certain parts of a photo. These are just wide adjustments that affect the entire photo. So we're going to do another one really quickly. Let's do before and after. I love looking at before and afters because you don't realize the impact that these small adjustments make until you see a before and after. Let's do a quick sharpen. This is not a smart layer yet. It's not a big deal because we still had our smart filters applied on top of it. So I'm going to right click. I'm going to make this a smart object so I can add a smart filter as a sharpen. So I have my layer selected. I'm going to go up to filter. It already saved my last filter that I did, which was sharpen. But I'm going to go the longer route so you can see how I did that. Just go down to sharpen, go all the way down to sharpen. I'm just going to do once. You can over sharpen. Do not over sharpen. So now I could take that away easily because it's now a smart filter. But I'm going to leave it on. So let's just group everything into a folder. So I'm going to select everything, group it into a folder, and now I can untoggle the visibility. So that's before. It's right from an iPhone. I did 0 adjustments. This is after just a quick couple minutes, and this is after. And a lot of times when you toggle before and after, you'll kind of start to go, okay, I think I need to make some adjustments after this. So I think it's a little bit over, it's starting to get a little over processed, and it's also the brightness and contrast. So I can go back to brightness and contrast, and I can reduce the brightness just a tiny bit. So now I can go back to my group, toggle it on and off. And I feel a little bit better about that. Of course, there's still some adjustments you can make, but that's the case for any photo. So here you go, before and after. We're going to do one more quick general photo edit, and then we're going to talk about gradient maps because I think they're really cool. And we're going to create a couple of quick social media posts to practice the gradient maps. And sometimes it's all about the cropping and how a photo is cropped. So let's say I wanted to do a quick crop of the photo. There's a crop tool right over here on the left, and you're going to see some little tabs that I can move to crop it. So what I want to do is I want to crop out kind of where this part of the mantle of the fireplace is. So I'm going to bring it up and let go, and I'm going to take this adjustment and bring it down and let go. And when I'm ready, I'm going to press enter, and I've officially cropped my photo. We're going to open up the piano JPEG, and this is a picture taken in a dark room on purpose. This is my piano, and I wanted to kind of demonstrate how to work with photos that are just too dark, that were taken without enough light, which can be challenging. And as a graphic designer, you're going to work with so many photos that are sent to you that were not taken with the proper lighting. So let's go ahead and unlock this layer. Let's go ahead and right click. Let's just go ahead and make it a smart object for right now. And let's just go and do a quick sharpen, filter, sharpen. Went ahead and sharpened it. So when we're dealing with a photo like this, sometimes when it's pretty much black and white, almost, there's pretty much no color, I like to go ahead and switch it to a pure black and white because there's still yellowness. There's yellowness to this white, and there's other little colors in here, and it kind of makes it look more dirty. So what I want to do is I want to do a quick black and white adjustment. And so you can kind of see before had some yellow to the white keys, and then after. Just quick. And then I want to go to exposure. So exposure is really good with black and white photography. It makes a big difference. So let's increase the brightness just a little bit. You can see how you can quickly overdo it. So just kind of a little brightness. And gamma correction. I want to add to the gamma correction. So I'm bringing out some of those midtones. So all those blacks, all those super dark areas, I'm going to move it and add to the gamma correction. You can see how it brings some of that out, makes it brighter. You can also go to levels and see on this levels right here. So this is all of your darker pixels and your whiter pixels. So there's a big spike right here in your lightest pixels, and that's probably from the white keys. And then you have a big spike right here from all the dark keys and this black section up here. So if I wanted to click and hold on the black point and make the darker, I can do that, but that washes out all the details of the piano. Or I can take some of the lighter colors and move it to the left, which I think has the best impact here because I think it's too dark to begin with. It wasn't taken in a really good, well-lit environment. So let's make some of those whiter pixels lighter, just like that. Not too much, just a little bit. We could always go to brightness and contrast and just do a general, this is kind of your quick, easy way to make something darker or lighter or have more contrast. It's kind of your quick cheat, I guess you could say. Instead of getting all into levels, this is kind of a way to do it a lot quicker, but you don't have as much control. But if you just wanted a quick brighten or a quick contrast, you could do that as well. So let's group these together into a folder and toggle it on and off. So that's before, had kind of a yellowish hue to the keys, and then after. So obviously brighter. I feel like I can use this photo and it doesn't look like it was taken in a basement. It kind of looks like it was taken in a little bit more of a professional lighted scenario. I wanted to go over Camera Raw Filter, and this was added to Photoshop a few years ago, but I really wanted to talk about it as a quick, super way to edit your photos. So as I've taught in several lessons, we can go to adjustments, and there's all sorts of adjustments we can add to photos: brightness, contrast, levels, curves, and these are the most powerful ways to individually edit a photo's characteristics. But if you're looking for a quick way to do a bunch of photos quickly with the same settings, this is something to really look at. So let's say I have 5 minutes. I just need to do a quick photo editing before I put this into a design project. I'm going to go up to Filter and do Camera Raw Filter. If you don't see this, you might have an older version of Photoshop. You will not have this, but you still will have your adjustments that you can do to each individual photo. And so basically what it does is it takes all these adjustments and combines it into one simple place. So Filter, Camera Raw Filter. It's a game changer, super quick to do edits. So it's going to bring up this entirely new thing. If you've ever used Photoshop Lightroom, it's kind of got some of the characteristics from the Lightroom. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're not going to go over what each individual thing means, but I wanted to show you how you can take all those individual adjustments and make them much quicker here. So we can just go to Basic. We can set the temperature, cool, warm, kind of like a cool look for this. Tint, we can tint it. Bring a little green, but I kind of like a little magenta in there, so we're just going to tint it a little bit. These are all going to be quick slides. Let's make it a little brighter. Just do our exposure. I like a little contrast to bring out the shadows. Of course, you could do highlights, bring them out. Really brings out some of the lightning. Shadows, kind of make them more dramatic or reveal more of the texture, kind of like it in the middle. Whites, make it a little brighter. And what are we going to do with our blacks? We can make them brighter. We can add a little texture. So you can see that's no texture. It's very kind of blurry. and then adding texture. It's a little bit like sharpness, but it just kind of does its own little thing there. So clarity, we can add clarity. So you can see with clarity, max clarity, it almost looks overly textured, and then reduce the clarity. And dehaze, we don't have too much haze in this one, so I think we're going to be okay. So vibrance, let's go ahead and take a little bit of that texture down. It's a little bit too washed out. So vibrance, remember that brings out all the saturation and all the hues. Saturation is just more of an overall. So you can way overdo it, or you can make it black and white, but let's do this. I'm actually going to take away the clarity, just make those 0. We can also punch in these manually, kind of like how it was before. Okay, so curve, you could do your curve like we did in the adjustments panel, but now we can make our shadows darker, our highlights more bright, just like we did before, but now it's just right here, easy to grab on there. We could do kind of some generic overall edits as well. Detail sharpening, we could sharpen it a little bit. Noise reduction, color noise reduction. We'll do the same thing but with color. Color mixer, we can add specific colors. This is just like the adjustment that we did earlier in the adjustments panel. It's just a quick way to do all these. Color grading, these are your shadows, midtones, and highlights. So let's say we want to mess with our midtones. We could take all the midtones in the photo and add a little color to it. Pretty neat. And you can study each individual. There's so much here. I could do an entire course on what each of these things mean, like luminance and blending and balance and all of this, but just kind of just doing a quick example to show you guys. So you can even do optical distortion. So in optics, you can make it kind of be convex. Vignette, you can add kind of around the edges, add a vignette. You can make a bright vignette or a dark vignette. Let's do a bright one. I don't want to do any distortion. You can also do manual transformation, so vertical, horizontal along a plane. Like if you wanted to put this on a product, or if you wanted to kind of do a perspective kind of warp thing, you could do it here. Effects, you can add a slight grain effect, give it texture. And this is a different type of vignetting. Kind of almost adds a color on top of the photo as opposed to being a part of the photo. So there is a lot of options here. It can be very overwhelming. You don't need to know what each one means per se. I mean, it's really good to eventually learn that, but it's also good to kind of experiment and see which one works for you. So there's kind of a quick after. There is our before and there is our after. So we can toggle between before and after. And if we like the after, we can click on OK. And there we go. So I just wanted to kind of demonstrate how quick and easy it was to use the camera raw filter if you just wanted to do some very quick edits and you wanted to have access to all the power of the adjustments panel, but a little bit more simplified so you can just quickly go through them all. I still recommend doing manual adjustments if you really want to get super into details. If you have lots of time to edit a photo, it's always better and has more power to individually edit them in the adjustments panel. But if not, the camera raw filter is a great quick way to get things done. We get to talk about one of my favorite adjustments, and that is gradient maps. It's a quick way to add a little bit of cool to your photos. So this is a brick picture I took when I was out walking around. And I love taking photos with my phone so I can grab textures that I can use on any type of background or design work. But it needs a little bit of work. So what I want to do is I want to add text on top of it and put a quote. So let's say I get my text tool and I click once and I type in a headline. I'm just quickly typing in a little quote and using Dido, which is a really nice serif typeface. And you can instantly tell when you have such a high contrast photo and you have type, it's kind of hard to read the type. And that's going to be the case for a lot of photography you find online. You're going to want to put a quote or a type on top of a photo, and it's going to be really, really hard to read the typography or the quote. So one thing you can do is you can lower the contrast of your background image so that the type can be more readable. And one way to do that is with gradient maps, and it's a great way to kind of demonstrate what this does. So I'm going to go ahead and double click, and I'm going to make this text white. And I'm going to select my background image. Go ahead and double click and unlock that. And I'm going to go up to my adjustments panel, and I'm going to add a gradient map. So this is what a gradient map does. So I can go ahead and customize this. I can click anywhere on this gradient map area, and it's going to bring up a gradient editor. And I'm going to quickly shift to a different photo so you can see the other one is going to be a little bit harder to demonstrate gradient maps, but I'm going to use the gradient map on this photo. Click on gradient map, and this is what a gradient map does. So these are your highlights over here, and these are your shadows. So everything that is a shadow in this photo, you can click right here on the color, and you can change it. So instead of whatever it was before, which is black, you can actually change the color on it. So let's do a highly saturated blue. And then all of the highlight colors, you can change the colors on that. So let's do a highly saturated red. So you can see how one side is blue. All these pixels that were darker are now blue, and all the pixels that were highlights are now red. You can reverse the two. So let's go ahead and reverse the two. And you can see how all the highlights are red and the shadows are blue. What makes this interesting is you can also change midtones too. So let's kind of switch this back to how it was. That kind of, those blues kind of naturally are more shadows than the reds. What's really powerful about this, you can actually do midtones too and add a third color. And all your midtones can be its own color. But what you can do is you can easily make this monochromatic too. So let's say these are your darker colors and these are your lighter colors. I can make all of the lighter pixels a similar blue, and it looks like you can't see anything because they're both blue now. So your highlights and shadows are all the same color. So I'm going to take the highlights but make this a lighter color. So you can easily do kind of this monochromatic look very quickly by using gradient maps. You can also make this darker, so make your shadows darker, so just moving along the hue picker and adding more black. And I can go over here and add more white. I can also even go up the hue slider and add maybe a little bit of purple in here. So you could do two lighter colors to make it really soft. So both of these are pretty high up in lightness, or you can make it really dark and bring out shadows. So this is just fantastic to play around with. And there's a bunch of pre-made presets as well. So you have some basics, which is just kind of be a black and white. You have blues, which some of these are reversed, so it looks a little bit silly. So that one, for example, you have all of your highlights dark and your lights light, so it's going to look a little creepy. But that's an easy fix if you find one that has the reverse, where you have your shadows as the darkest color. So let's say, for example, this one, where you have kind of the darkest color here and the lightest color on the right. That makes the most sense in this situation. So let's switch back to our brick photo. We want to make this monochromatic so we can make this background photo low contrast so the type can be high contrast against the brick. So here we are, we can customize this, we can use some presets that they have, or we can do our own, which is what we're going to do. We go to basics, select black and white. So let's make it kind of this deep, rich blue brick. So we're going to select all of the shadows, all the dark shadows in this photo. We're going to go to color and let's do a highly saturated blue. Let's make it a little bit darker. And we're going to take all of our highlights, make it a highly saturated blue, but make it lighter. And we can go back and make this a little bit darker, just to give it a little bit more of a contrast and punch, but not so much to overwhelm. So see how that type is a lot more readable. Once again, making adjustments to this. There's also midtones you can add. In the middle, change all your midtones to a specific color, which can have some really interesting effects. But let's stick with blue so it can remain monochromatic. And that just gives us ultimate control over how this looks. So you can still see the texture, but the type is the main event here. So now we can finesse this typography. I can go to my properties panel and I can scroll down all the way down here. Let's make it a nice center alignment. Let's also make it all caps. So I'm down here in type options, making it all caps and adding a little bit more leading or spacing between the sentences. Right now it's 248. This is a pretty big document for it to be 248 because my point size for my typography is 304. So this is probably a pretty large document because this is the original photo that I took. So it's probably like 4,000. If I go down here, there I'm right. 3,000 by 4,000 pixels is the size of this photo. So let's go ahead and change that, make it a little bit bigger. So instead of 248, maybe 260. Just adding a little spacing, maybe a little bit more, maybe 280. There we go, just kind of letting those lines breathe a little bit. So let's break this typography up a little bit. Type is more readable with, and I'm just doing, just pressing return, just doing a physical line break. Type is more readable with high contrast. We can add even more spacing. Let's try 360 or maybe even 440, just making it nice big wide gaps. That's a little too much. It's always give or take. Trying to figure it out. Just getting my move tool, unselecting. And that's great because now I can use this texture. I can show that through in the photo and still have the typography be very readable. And that was the whole point of using gradient maps. Just one way, one method you could do to use something in the background that adds an element to the design but never takes away from the readability of the document. We can stylize this a little more. I have Dido, but what if we did an italicized Dido? So let's do italic. Adds a little more flair of style, a little more elegance. And I love contrast in my type as well. So instead of just this big block of white text, let's take readable, which is probably the most important word, and let's do something that is a high contrast against blue on the color wheel. That's usually yellows, golds. So let's try to find a gold. So I'm right here between my yellows and oranges, kind of right in the middle. I'm going to be able to find a gold. So gold is not orange. Gold has a little bit of gray in it. So it's going to be somewhere here in the hue slider, but I want to make it bright enough to really pop out. Let's add some more contrast by adding a little bit of a box behind the typography. I'm going to go down here to my Shapes tool, going to get my Rectangle tool. I'm going to sample, get my eyedropper tool, one of these darker blues. So down here is pretty dark. So I'm going to go ahead and sample that blue, get a couple of rectangle tools, and just create a shape. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the shape, and I'm just going to duplicate this. I'm just holding down Option and dragging. And then I'm going to hold down Shift and just make that a little bit bigger, just like what we did in the other videos. I'm going to hold down Option and drag. I'm going to hold down Shift so I can just adjust that one side and just keep going. This just adds a little bit of a design element but behind the typography. So now I can select all of these boxes. I can go up to alignment just to make sure all those are center aligned. I can go up here to my alignment panel and go ahead and do an align horizontal. It's going to line all those up for me. And I can take all of these boxes and drag them behind the typography. So I have all of those selected. I'm going to drag them all the way behind my typography. I can lock my brick layer, just going to lock it. And I can highlight everything else. And I can kind of find a better center point for this. Going to do my smart guides till I get my little pink line. There it is. Now I know that is center aligned in the document. And now I know it's center aligned horizontally and vertically. So just a simple quote I was able to do by using gradient maps in my adjustments, doing some quick typography, adding some contrast, adding some boxes, super quick quote. We're going to do a couple more next. Let's say this is a very large document. Right now it's 3,000 by 4,000 pixels. That's really big. Let's say I want to scale this down and I want to do a different size. Let's say I want to post it on Instagram tomorrow. There's a couple ways we can do this. One of the best ways, in my opinion, I can keep this document as is because who knows if I want to make it different sizes. Keep this original document and just create a new document the size that I want it to be. So I'm going to go to File, New. Let's stick with a typical Instagram post size, 1080 by 1080. So 1080 by 1080 and click on Create. So there's our Instagram. So I can go back to our brick photo that we edited. Make sure I unlock that background brick layer. You don't want to have anything locked when you want to copy and paste content to another document. So everything is unlocked. So I have my Move tool selected. I'm going to click up here in a blank area, click and drag, and it's going to select all of my layers for me. Or I can just click on my lowest layer, go all the way up to the top, hold down Shift, and I can select it all that way as well. Either way works. I'm going to go up to Edit, and I'm going to copy, or you could do your keyboard shortcut. So I'm going to copy it, go to a new document. I'm going to do a quick paste. So I'm going to go down to Paste, paste it all in. You can see it's a super large size, so I'm going to have to scale this down, which is no big deal because everything's a smart object. I don't have to worry about anything messing up. So I'm just going to go ahead and scale it down. I'm not holding down Shift. It's going to scale it nicely for me. And I'm going to fit it into this Instagram post. And this is a great way to do other types of sizes too. Just kind of size it up. See, I got my smart guides, I got my horizontal, and I got my vertical smart guides, letting me know everything's nicely aligned. I'm going to let go, press Enter. And now we are in a newly sized document. We are at 1080 by 1080 pixels. I can export this easily to be able to post it on Instagram tomorrow. Of course, I'd want to change the typography because it's not a real quote, but at least I have a template that I can use to put a real quote in there. So let's say I want to export it. We'll talk about exporting a little bit later, but I feel like I just want to let you know how to do this just in case you're excited about your project that you're working on right now and you want to post it somewhere on social media, Facebook, whatever. You just go up to File, Export, Export As. So File, Export, Export As. You could also do a Save As, and we'll talk about the difference between the two, but let's do an Export As. It's really good for digital, online kind of files. So we're doing an Export As. And if you ever post it to Facebook and it's like, wow, it's a lot blurry than I thought it would be, you can always change the scale of it. So right now this is 1 times. You can export it like 2 times the size. And as long as you have smart objects and everything that we've already done before, it should scale nicely for you. So you can always do a little bit of a higher scale if you wanted to, but you could just stick with 1. That's fine, just in case you ever had that problem. And I know it's going to be 1.3 megabytes when I export it. And that's it. I'm not going to mess with this. We'll go over more exporting options later on. Just do a quick export, and there it is. Export it. So what's really good, let's kind of switch gears. We're going to create a couple more posts practicing what we've learned with gradient maps. But what's really neat about gradient maps is I have this gradient map right here. I can bring in any photo and I don't have to do that gradient map adjustment again. It'll automatically apply that filter to everything underneath it. So let's say I want to bring in a picture of a person. So let's say I have this woman with a mask on. and I want to drag it in to Photoshop. Right now, she is on top of that gradient filter layer. And I'm going to show you right here. Here's the gradient map filter, and it's applying it to the brick. If I drag her underneath the gradient map, all of a sudden, it'll apply to her, which is really cool. So now I don't need the brick anymore. I'm going to just do something different. I can just drag that in the trash can. So now I have her, and I can adjust the type accordingly. So we can go ahead and get rid of all these rectangles. And whenever you have like repetitive layers like this, like each one of these is a separate rectangle. I usually like to just group things in folders because it's a little bit easier to manage than having this big long list of layers. So don't be afraid of grouping things into folders. So now I can easily delete that instead of having to select each one. So now I can kind of mess around with this text a little bit more. So let's double click it. Let's go up and let's go to our properties panel, just double clicking our text, highlighting it. I would like to do a left alignment. So I'm in my left align in my paragraph options. I'm going to do a left align. And I also want to close the gap between the leading as well. So instead of 35, let's do 26. And this is where the fun begins because you can really mess around with photos and how they are structured. So right now it's this old gradient map right here, but I can always go back in to my properties and change it a little bit. So let's make it a little bit brighter. So I'm in my highlights and change all the highlights to make it a little bit brighter all across the board. Just a little bit brighter, but still low contrast enough for me to read the text. So I can move her up a little bit because we never want to have text block the eyes. And let's say make statements can be our typography. And let's change the typeface. So instead of a traditional serif, let's change this to, and what's great is you have this filter, which we can decide, I just want to have a slab serif. We could do a slab serif. And let's take off all caps. It's a little strong. And let's have everything be lowercase to be softer. You can also change the coloring if you want to make it high contrast. And it also needs kind of an anchor. So you have this kind of lowercase typography. It feels like it's kind of floating in no man's land, and it needs to have some kind of design anchor. And a lot of times it's a dividing line, it's a box, it's a shape, something that helps to anchor that text to that area of the document. So it could be as easy as getting a rectangle tool and just drawing a small little rectangle. Let's make sure we make it that same color. Just something to anchor it. So this is the final that I came up with after a little bit of tweaking. I felt like she was not popping out enough, all being monochromatic. So if I go to my gradient map, you can kind of see how I decided for the highlights to do a slightly different warm color, contrasted against the cooler colors, kind of adds a nice dramatic effect. So that's what I did with this gradient map, and I switched that back to white to make it really stand out. And I have that little anchor, just like some kind of little design element or that helps to solidify that position of the typography. It helps draw your eye down to that block of typography. So let's move on. Let's do something a little bit different. Let's go back a couple of steps when we had kind of our blue gradient map. Let's add a different photo from pexels.com. I found this really neat statue photo that might look nice. You can find any other photo of your choice to use. I'm going to bring this in. And right now it's on top of the gradient filter. So I can go ahead and make that a little bit bigger and bring that underneath that gradient map filter, and automatically that neat effect is applied. So now I can make it a little bit bigger, stretch all the way across, maybe bring more emphasis on the angel's face. I can even add a brightness adjustment just to do a quick brightening of that photo. A little bit of contrast. And let's edit the type. Let's do something, let's do a juxtaposition between the traditional angel sculpture and using a more modern typeface. That might be very playful. So let's do a sans serif typeface, and we can go to our filter, and if we know we want a sans serif, we can go ahead and just show sans serif typefaces. And there's one that I really like called Komu, and I believe it's an Adobe font. So if you have an Adobe subscription, you have access to this font, but you can use it's a condensed font, so it's very low in width. It's a very short condensed, so you can really pack a lot in a small width space. So I'm going to do this Komu A, and we work a little bit with this later and some future work. So let's go ahead and do Komu A. So gradient maps are cool. Let's kind of tighten that spacing. Since this is a condensed typeface, we also want to be able to tighten it in the leading as well. So let's adjust that, maybe 24, or we're gonna have to do a custom number, aren't we? Let's do 20. It's a little too tight. Let's do 22. And let's separate this cool. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna cut this cool out. So I'm just gonna do edit, cut, and I'm just gonna create a separate text box so I can have more control. Just pasting it, and now I have it as its own little layer. And let's make this a different color for contrast. Let's use the same gold that we've been using. So when we look at this photo, if we move it to the left, we have the eyes gazing to the left. We have the statue mostly kind of being more on the left. So if we also have the typography on the left, it's very left heavy. So let's provide a little bit of balance or interest in the photo by bringing the typography over here to the right. Now all of a sudden you have this upper left to lower right movement of the eye. It feels very natural. But it would be great to have a little bit of an anchor that can help me really solidify or place this typography here on the document. And you can do this in so many ways. Before we use the line, a divider line or a box, you could also use little small graphical elements like a little cross or a plus sign, which you see used often. So we're going to do that right now. We're going to get the rectangle tool, and we're going to just do a little box or a little rectangle. We're going to make this, let's do fill, let's do the same color. So let's do our recently used color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick option drag, and I'm going to get the rotate tool, and I'm just going to hold down the shift key and rotate it until it clicks into place at 90 degrees. So I can eyeball this and try to find a center point, or I could select both of my shapes right here, and I can do a center alignment up here. So just doing a center alignment, but also doing a horizontal vertical align. So just kind of aligning it center and aligning it vertical, and we'll do lots of alignment in Adobe Illustrator later on. So now I want to make this one unit. So I can merge these layers together. So instead of just being two independent shapes, this is just one merged object. So I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go down to merge shapes. So with both of these layers selected, right click, merge shapes. It's going to just make them one easy to use layer. Looks like there's some kind of stroke on there. So just go to your appearance panel and just make sure it's on null. Or you could do a little keyboard shortcut. If you ever want to quickly merge layers, you could do Command E and it's going to quickly merge layers for you. So now I have this one little element and it can kind of be our anchor. So I'm going to make it smaller and bring it right here. Use my keyboard arrows, just kind of nudge it down. I can right click, duplicate layer, or I can just hold down Option and drag, whatever you feel comfortable with, and I can make a second one down there. Just adds a graphical element. It's not required. You don't have to put this stuff on everything. I just think it kind of adds a small element to the design. And if you ever want to check on alignment, especially with typography and with a little shape like this, you can always go up to View and go to Rulers. So this is going to show your rulers. And we go to View, Rulers. All of a sudden you're going to see your rulers on the top and you're going to see rulers over here. Let me go ahead and move my toolbar over so you can see. And you have rulers on the left. So you can see this is a 1080 pixel document. So it starts at 0 and it goes all the way over to 1080 pixels in width. And it's also 1080 in height. So it goes all the way to 1080 in height. So what happens when I click up on the ruler on the top here, I click and drag, you're going to get a guide. And these guides are fully customizable. So let's say I want to make sure this is aligned properly. And this can be any design element. I can adjust this so it's at the top of the G, and I can just make sure everything is lined up. I use my keyboard arrows to quickly change it. And also I can click and make another one. So I can make sure my other one is lined up properly. You can also do it vertically as well. So I can click over on my vertical ruler, click and drag. And this is really handy if you're doing logo design or if you're doing a layout and you're blocking out a design. You can really kind of double check your alignment just to make sure it looks good. It also helps you know where the weight is in your design. And let's say I don't want to see these things anymore. You can click and drag them all the way out to the ruler and let go, and they are removed. So I can click and drag it off to the ruler and it just kind of goes away. Or you can toggle on your view or go down to show, and you can go down to guides and you can just uncheck them and you don't have to have them. And there's keyboard shortcuts too to toggle them on and off. So we'll go over that too. Every Adobe program has guides that you can do with rulers. So once you learn it in Photoshop, we'll go over it again in Illustrator. So there you have it. You can do a quick export. You can go to File, Export As, do a quick export, and just that's it. Export, and you're done. Let's do one more, maybe going away from the blue and doing something a tiny bit different. I'll see you in the next lesson. For the next design, we're going to do this one. We're going to recreate this Instagram post you see right here. We are going to just start a fresh new document. And we are going to bring in that photo that we found. If you ever want to look up these photos on Pexels, you can always type in the text in Pexels or type in the number, and you should be able to find the photo, but please use other photos. Sometimes photographers tend to remove photos and add new ones every day. So feel free to use something kind of similar and you don't have to find the same exact photo. So I'm going to drag that photo right into the document. That'll make it a little bit easier. It also automatically makes it a smart object, which is kind of handy. So now I can kind of crop this. Because right now this is interesting, but I really want to, when you have an Instagram post or social media post, they're seen pretty small on a phone. So you really want to have a high emotional impact and connection with the person and the action that they're doing. They're jumping, they're in the middle of some experience, and you want to capture that. So I was going to zoom in a little bit more on the boy and click enter. So let's add a really dynamic pop of color with a gradient map. So let's go to our adjustments panel and go to gradient map. So we can click on gradient map, and of course there's a lot of different things we can do. We could do one that's mostly warm tones. And you're really going to have has a lot of highlights in it. So you're really going to see a lot more of an effect when we change the highlights. I want to kind of have a little, I don't want it to be pink, but I don't want it to be red. I want it to be kind of in the middle, and that's a kind of a popular color choice. It's not quite pink, not quite red. There's just kind of in between that point that I'm going to find here and do like a very high saturation. And I think it might help if I take this darker color and bring out some more shadows. Or even better, I can add some blue tones to this. So I'm going to keep it kind of at this darker level and bring it down to blue. And what that does is you have the warm and the cool kind of together, working together. There we go. So there's my gradient map. I can always add another adjustment layer if I want to change brightness contrast. Make the photo brighter or darker so I can read some text a little bit better. Because remember, high contrast doesn't work with a quote or typography on top. So let's go to brightness contrast. Let's just reduce the brightness just a tad. A little contrast to add that pop. So let's add some typography. Let's take the type tool, make it a little bit bigger, and it's kind of funny because they're not popping out because we need to just go ahead and make this white. You know what's happening is the gradient map is on the top, so it's applying the same gradient map filter on top of the typography. So even though the typography is white, see right here, it has that gradient map applied to it. So let's bring the words on the very top layer, and we don't have that problem anymore. So I really liked this typography. It's called Abril Text. Let's make these words a little bit bigger. And the S and the D are super close, and I just want to have a little bit more leading. So I'm going to go to Properties, go down and just add this the tiniest bit of leading. Do 26, let that breathe a little bit. So now we need to do some kind of anchoring, because right now we have a great photo, we have some good typography, but we need like a graphical element to really tie them together. So we have this person jumping, there's a lot of action, and we have this simple typography that's left or right. It's not really doing a whole lot. So we can add a small graphical element to play against him jumping, kind of in a diagonal way. So what if we did diagonal rectangles to frame the typography? So what we're going to do is we're going to get a rectangle tool. Just make a simple rectangle. We're going to fill it with white. Get our move tool. Move it. Let's go ahead and make a duplicate. So we're going to hold down Option and drag, or just duplicate your layer. So now we have two of these. Let's select both of them. And let's just rotate it a little bit just to give it an angle. Press enter. And let's put these on either side of the typography. So all this is doing is just bringing everything together. And once again, these graphic elements are not required for everything. It just depends on what you're using it for. So there we go. We created a couple more little small quick posts using what we've learned with adjustments and typography and shapes. So hopefully you enjoyed this editing section. I just refilmed this to make it a lot longer, and a lot more detailed. I wanted to make sure you understood each adjustment so that you can utilize that when doing design projects. I have 2 student projects for you. The first one is going to practice using your adjustment layers and doing some minor photo editing. I want you to take a photo from your phone or camera, and I want you to edit that photo. It could be a picture of an object, a picture of your dog, a picture of your workspace. I'd love to see how you took a raw, unedited photo and made it a lot more polished and professional. The second project is to create a social media post similar to what we used before using a gradient map. You can use a picture of a person, an object, and use a simple quote to go along with it. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with for your projects. Of course, all projects are optional and they help you practice the tools that we learn throughout the class.